seemingly blindly today, especially in America, and maybe especially among younger people? Why do people seem to cling to what a doctor, an organization, or a political stance, or what a news network or source says seemingly religiously? I'm not talking about religion specifically, I don't think, but maybe what I seem to see is replacements for faith or a good family / meaningful life, etc. Having listened to you for many years now and as minor clergy in the Orthodox Church, my questions are, have you attended any services in the Eastern Orthodox churches, or have you done an in-depth exploration of Eastern Orthodox Christianity? How do you respond to the idea that your personal theology aligns so well with what is taught by the Eastern Orthodox churches? Well, I'm going to try to answer all those questions at the same time. Let's start with the third set. Why do you think there are so many people who are prone to just following an ideology seemingly blindly today, especially in America, and maybe especially among young people? Why do people cling to what a doctor, etc., says seemingly religiously? Well, I would say that something has to be done with the religious impulse. So, and we can think about what the religious impulse is critically and deeply for a minute. So imagine that you might consider defining the religious impulse as the consequence of the necessity of having a goal at the highest possible level of conceptualization and organization, psychological organization, social organization. We have goals on a daily basis and a weekly basis and a monthly basis, and personal goals and familial goals and social goals, but all of that has to be nested in the broader world of value. Let's say all of that has to be nested within something like, well, what is the ultimate goal? What is the final goal? Underneath which all of those more proximal goals are subsumed, and that becomes a religious question. I would say by definition, it's an impossible question to answer in some sense, because to provide a definitive answer would mean that we would have to possess the classic attributes of God, at least his omniscience, to be able to finally answer, well, what is it all for? But we're still stuck with the necessity of identifying the highest level goal, and that's really that the identification of that goal was exactly what our traditional religious structures were attempting to do, for better or worse. And they did that with practice and with ritual and with drama and with symbolism and with music and with art and with literature, with dance, all of which are integrated in more archaic communities, let's say. Those were all our attempts to orient ourselves at the highest possible level of being. Perhaps we're all striving to be, at least in our more noble moments, we're trying to be good people ethically and to serve the good, whatever that might be. And it's the religious domain that strives to answer those questions at the highest possible level of abstraction. Now, if you lack that answer, if you're divorced from a religious structure, then you have to find a replacement somewhere, because the question isn't going to go away. The question, what's it all for, or what should I orient myself toward, or what should I imitate, or what should I be in awe of? You're stuck with that. Or even in its negative sense, well, what's the purpose of life anyways, and why bother? And so that can lead you into a very destructive nihilism. And so you're stuck with the problem. And if your culture hasn't provided you with a solution, or you've rejected that solution, or the solution no longer seems tenable to you, maybe because it's fallen prey to a rationalist critique, that doesn't mean the problem goes away. You find a replacement for it, and for better or for worse. Now, the first of the set of questions I grouped together, we'll turn to it, was, I would like to know how to believe in the divine even though it's a loose end. Well, it is and it isn't. I'll answer that in relationship also to, could you please tell us how your conception of God has changed in the last year or two? Well, one thing I've been thinking about lately is the idea of thought as a dialectical process. So imagine that you posit a question in your imagination. Your life presents you with a question. What should I do today? What would a person do? What should a person do in this situation? What should I do with my life? What should I do with this relationship? And answers appear in the theater of your imagination. Or doubts arise, but something happens. You send out a call, essentially, and you respond, or something in you responds with the generation of an answer. And or maybe multiple answers. And in the case of multiple answers, you can then undertake an argument in your head. That's the dialectical process between the two positions that might have emerged in the course of these revealed answers. So there's a revelatory element to thought, which is the appearance of new information in the theater of your imagination. And there's a dialectical element, which is the combat between different revealed thoughts to evaluate them and rank order them in terms of their credibility and applicability. Okay, so now imagine that we have that faculty. We have the faculty for revelation, and we have the faculty for dialectical thought. Now, imagine that you formulate in your imagination, or perhaps your culture helps you formulate, the image of an ideal being. And that might be God as such, but it also might be, say, in the case of Christianity with Christ, or Buddhism with Buddha, or Islam with Muhammad, the idea of a person who's divine in some important manner, which brings the divinity down to earth. In any case, whether the imaginary being in the theater of your imagination is purely divine, God himself, or incarnated in some sense in a human figure, it enables you to produce an avatar of your imagination with whom you can converse. And so you could ask yourself, well, you can ask yourself such questions as if you're plagued by doubts about what you should do in a situation, is, well, what would you do if you were trying to do the best possible thing? Or what would someone who is always striving to do the best possible thing do? You formulate that question and you might get an answer. This is the proper pathway forward. Now, that doesn't mean you'd be necessarily inclined to implement that. It might be too difficult, or maybe you even might doubt that that's a practical way forward. But not only can you produce avatars in your imagination and then use them as sources of revealed thought, but your culture can fill in the attributes of that avatar. So, for example, if you're Christian and you've been taught about the life of Christ as it's portrayed in the Gospels, all those descriptions flesh out the personality. And then, of course, the image of Christ is reflected in Western culture in a multitude of ways, all of which inform the structure of that internal avatar, and which, in principle, flesh it out so that it's the potential source of revealed truth in imagination, buttressed by all that cultural input. And so you would say, well, in some ways, that avatar with whom you can converse is now the internal embodiment of all the ideas about what constitutes the highest good that our entire culture has been able to create and communicate, insofar as you've been exposed to that, are able to understand it. And then So you could imagine that that could be of substantial practical worth, regardless of the ontological reality of that avatar of your imagination. But then I don't think that the issue necessarily ends there, because you can then ask yourself, well, does that imaginary avatar share in any real being? And then you ask yourself, well, is there anything real about the hypothetical ideal? And it seems to me that there is something real about the hypothetical ideal. We recognize its manifestation in other people, and we're happy about that. We're inspired by that. We might be in awe of that. We certainly recognize it as a good thing. We're pleased when that manifests itself in us. Its manifestation in us certainly makes us more attractive to other people, and also, I would say, of more use to other people, and also more likely to be truthful and perhaps able to take proper care of and love other people. And I don't think any of that isn't real. And so that means that there's some relationship between the imaginary ideal and reality itself that's not trivial. And I don't know what that might mean in the final analysis. You have a God in the imagination, which is our conception of God, and does that bear any relationship to the real God, or indicate that there is a real God? And the answer to that is, we don't know. I wouldn't dismiss the idea so rapidly.